Sorry, got to be careful of my script. Good morning, and thank you for being with us. You may have heard me tell other witnesses to ensure that they don't use unparliamentary language, and I'm not suggesting you'd use unparliamentary language per se. It's just if you're quoting someone else, I'm not sure if you're going to in your submission. And the other thing that we've been asking witnesses to be conscious of identifying or naming persons who may not wish to be named. Now, I'm not sure if you're doing that either in your submissions, but it's just a precursor to prevent those things from happening from the committee's point of view. Again, thank you. Could you just identify yourself and your part of your organisation when you first speak for the benefit of Hansa, who is ready? Thank you. And you know the format, a 5-minute opening statement, after which the committee members will have questions for you.
Good morning. My name's Matilda Alexander. I'm the patron of the LGBTI Legal Service. And good morning to you all. I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, Meanjin, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout Queensland listening today. I acknowledge the continuous work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the LGBTIQ+, brother boy and sister girl communities and recognise their leadership in this space. Thank you for inviting our service to appear at this public hearing. We note the importance of these changes to members of the LGBTI community. These are issues that do not affect all Queenslanders equally, and sufficient weight should be given to the voices of LGBTI people, and particularly trans and gender diverse folk, who stand to gain or lose significant rights from these changes. Accordingly, it would have been good to see more LGBTI and specifically trans voices on the list today. The LGBTI Legal Service welcomes the introduction of this bill, with minor fine-tuning recommended. On a personal level, this will mean that my kids' birth certificates, which currently read mother and other parent, can be changed so that their other mother is not quite literally othered every time we use them. The common law has long recognised the non-binary and flexible approach to sex and gender. I was at uni when I learnt about the Kevin case that allowed a trans man to marry a cis woman, and at a time when same-sex marriage was still years away. The High Court in AB against WA has articulated that gender should not be regarded merely as a matter of chromosomes. It is partly a psychological question, one of self-perception, and partly a social question, how society perceives the individual. This proposed bill follows this line of reasoning and also adopts the practice that is now entrenched in many other states and territories. These changes are not new or radical. These changes will not have unforeseen consequences. They will bring Queensland into line with other jurisdictions such as Tasmania, Victoria and ACT. These changes are a reflection of the recognition in broader society that our LGBTI community is no longer hidden in a closet. We cannot be ignored on paper or in real life. We are out here and demanding our rights. The minor changes we're recommending today request the equal treatment of transgender people in custody so that we have a clear, single process for transition, regardless of where someone lives. We are also recommending clear protections be introduced to ensure the deferrable and irreversible medical treatments are not performed on intersex infants and children unless and until they can provide free, full and informed consent. We also believe that a child should be entitled to attend a single-sex school for the sex by which that child identifies, regardless of what the record reflects. Now is the time when the government needs to step in and protect our vulnerable LGBTI kids from discrimination and exclusion in education in order to ensure safe and accessible schools. We are also excited to see the first changes set in motion following the groundbreaking Building Belonging report of the QHRC, including protection for non-binary identities, definitions of sex characteristics, and the removal of outdated exemptions allowing discrimination against trans people wanting to work with children and gay and lesbian people seeking help with conception. The LGBTI community thanks you for seeing us in these changes, for allowing us to express our true identities without unnecessary and harmful surgeries, for allowing our rainbow families to exist on paper as we do in real life. A birth certificate is so much more than a piece of paper. It is a formal recognition of identity and a ticket to more equal treatment. It is those of us whose identity has been closeted, explicitly wrongly recorded, and offensively expressed that will benefit from these laws. I remind you that 40% of people voted against same-sex marriage, and at least that percentage of opposing submissions are made to you today. I urge you to listen to the voices of the folk whose rights and lives hang in the balance today, those who are directly and personally affected. Keep strong in your support for our LGBTIQ+ community. We thank you and we encourage you to pass this bill in Parliament.
Thank you. Laura?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you for your very passionate opening statement, and I appreciate your personal appearance today in addition to your written submission. I just had a point of clarification in your written submission. So recommendation 1, you talk about, you recommend that once a child has attained the age of 12 years of age, their consent must be required to change the parentage details on their own birth certificate. Is it currently 16, or what is the current age where the child's consent is required, or is it not required at all?
There's not really, as far as I'm aware, there's not a clear ability for a child to have their voice recorded in that way. So I think this is an opportunity to look at the way that we've done birth certificates pretty badly for a long time now, and this is an opportunity to look at all of those different aspects. And obviously, when a child gets to be a certain age, they get to have some more say over their own expressions of identity.
Okay. And then sorry, Chair, if I might ask just a further follow-up. It's not really a follow-up. It's in relation to recommendation 2. You talk about clause 12 and how in its current form it restricts parentage to a maximum of 2 people in total, and you recommend that there be no limits on the parentage. Is there any other Australian jurisdiction that has adopted that we could look at?
I can take that question on notice for you, but certainly it would make sense in terms of the way that our families are often taking effect. And it might not just be for the LGBTIQ+ communities. There are other families that more than 2 people are participating in that, whether it's through surrogacy, step parenting, or a range of different other mechanisms.
Okay, I'll leave that one with. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. In your opening statement, you made a comment that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that gender is much more than chromosomes. I think through this hearing and also in some of the submissions, there's this very definitive, as in sex, as in what's on the birth certificate, and gender are 2 very different things. Could you make comment on that, given that it has been basically agreed by so many in this conversation today?
So that was not my quote, that was a quote from the High Court in relation to a trans man who wanted to change his birth certificate without undergoing an unnecessary surgery. So the High Court looked at that matter, which was a matter against the WA, the Western Australian Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and the High Court said there's not a simple way. You can't look between someone's legs. I mean, they use the term gender, but equally the term sex would be applicable there. They're saying it's not a clear-cut way that the High Court considered at that point. So that was a number of years ago now, and I think we've come to the position that we've come to now, which is a much broader recognition of sex and gender.
And a follow-up question, please, Chair.
Yep.
Understandably, yes, you're correct in saying that, the submissions, are probably 50-50 in support and opposition. I note that within the LGBTI community, obviously there is opposing submissions as well, including one from LGB Alliance, which basically stated that it damages the lesbian, gay and bisexual liberation movement. Can you make a comment on that from the aspect of legal services and your experience?
Yeah, certainly our lesbian clients and my experience as a queer woman, I can't see any damage that could be done to my life by allowing transgender people to have their recognition. And in fact, this bill does serve to benefit lesbians who are parents, for example, and and queer women who are parents. So I think the LGB Alliance, it's very notable that the TI is missing from there, and that this bill in particular does give rights to the transgender and intersex communities that have been long fought for.
All right, thank you.
Jonty?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Matilda. Yes, look, the member for Noosa's question is probably where I was going to head, and you've kind of clarified that we have had submissions from people who identify as being lesbian or representing lesbian groups who have had alternate views. And I guess your submission is that, that lesbians are not a homogenous group, but that you don't identify risk in this bill for some of the issues around erasing women's rights.
No, not at all. I'm a feminist myself, and I've supported many women's organisations and women's rooms. I don't think that this does do that. It allows trans women to be also included. It allows all women. So to say some women should be protected, some women should not be protected based on a range of largely irrelevant factors in that person. Really, when they're coming to a service, they need a service, regardless of whether they're a cis or a trans woman. And some of the other submitters, Sister Six Inside, for example, pointed out the lack of availability of services for gender diverse and trans folks, and how important that kind of level of service delivery is. I don't think that by providing those services, and many services, Queensland Women's Services, have been accessed by trans folk over the years, and there's never been an issue that I'm aware of. And certainly the DJAG briefing note went through quite a lot of examples internationally as well, where this kind of fear that cisgendered men are going to start pouring into the women's services and demanding to be seen by saying that they're women is actually not. That's not what's happened in practice. That's not what has happened in other jurisdictions throughout Australia. That's not what has happened internationally. So we're not groundbreaking here. We can look around the world. We can see whether or not these fears are well-founded. And in my view, they are not.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Chair?
Yep.
Just on that, in terms of being a women's, or in terms of offering services, you would be completing risk assessments that take into consideration broader issues, or issues broader than just gender. Is that correct? When you're looking at, I guess, the composition of who to offer services to, you're running a risk assessment that looks more broadly at a person's compatibility with a service rather than just looking at gender as being a safeguard.
Yeah, so certainly you'd be looking at conflicts of interest and matters such as that, and potential for violence, or whatever other issues. I mean, I think the idea that we can exclude any particular group of women is something that is well and truly in the past, including trans women.
Thank you.
Laura or John?
I have no further.
Yep. I'll come back to you. Sandy?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Look, one last question. Earlier we heard of some options, including a gender identification certificate instead of a birth certificate. We heard the reasons why that is discriminatory within itself. How would you see if, and the member for Currumbin actually asked the question earlier about why do we actually have the birth sex on our birth certificates and what purpose does it serve? Would an option be that if sex isn't required on a birth certificate, that it just be left off, or everyone was just to have a gender identity certificate instead of birth certificate?
My understanding is that this does allow sex to be left off the birth certificate. Certainly the earlier bill, after the bill did. I might have to go back and just recheck whether that's the case here. So you could opt in to have sex on the birth certificate or not. I could check that for you. But yeah, certainly a gender recognition certificate is something we're strongly opposed to. Anything that makes trans people second-class citizens, that does not give them the same documentation, will out them, will cause then physical danger will cause emotional danger, will cause harm. We are strongly opposed to anything that's going to cause greater harm. This law is about remedying the harm that we have been through as a community for decades. This is a time to make things better for the LGBTI community. This is not the time to entrench and perpetuate difference and discrimination.
I think what I was asking was that if we all had the same documentation that had our gender identity instead of our birth sex for the purposes of registering at schools and the different examples we've been given, that then wouldn't be discriminatory. It'd be the same for all of us. If
we all had our preference of how we wanted to be called, whether we all wanted to be called women or men or another something or non-binary or whatever else. Yeah, so I understand the purpose of this law is to create a situation where people can have their. I don't know if I'm quite understanding your question, because my understanding of the purpose of this legislation is to create a document where people can have a birth certificate that reflects their gender, their sex and gender, their identity.
I think where the confusion is, we've been talking about birth certificate, which is a record of the physiological, as in sex, that we're born with, versus the gender we identify with. And I think that's where we're getting that word sex and gender. But if literally that birth certificate was instead a birth record of the sex we were born, however, everyone is issued with a gender identification instead of a birth certificate, then literally it's all the same, and the documents that you present, there is no difference, and it has the gender identity. And I suppose I'm asking, would that be a good solution that has been put forward? Which is different to what the bill is proposing, which is to change the birth certificate.
Sorry, I don't think I quite understand. So you're saying change birth certificates to gender recognition certificates and have something separate that's a birth record? What we commonly know as the birth certificate be a birth record, but we're all issued, instead of a birth certificate, a gender identification certificate for the purposes of everyday life in our having to go to school, get our licenses, etc. Licenses, you don't need to have gender. Like these are kind of things. Why do we need to have gender on all of these things anymore? It's not relevant for driving a car. I mean, I think these are all, we've been talking about, there's been discussion papers and there's been consultations about this going on for, I feel like it's close to a decade now. These proposals were all discussed. We discussed, gender identity certificates and putting gender on, putting sex on, all of these things. Like this bill is, a lot of hard work has been gone into it. All of these kind of things that you're proposing have been well and truly ventilated through the consultation process. And this is the answer, I think, that best addresses all of those needs.
Look, thank you so much. I think understanding that for many of us, we haven't been privy to the last decade of what has been presented. It has never been sent through to us, so that's why we're asking these questions. But thank you.
Laura or John, because we're gone over time.
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your written submission. Thank you for your time today. But before you run away, I think the question on notice was, you recommended the bill be amended to not restrict parentage to a maximum of 2 people. Are there other Australian institutes doing this, and you said that you wanted to take that on notice? Did you?
Yeah, I can take that on notice. And wasn't there a question about the 12? Did you want me to put the...
Oh, I'm happy to put that to GJAC.
Okay, all right.
And, are you able to provide your response by 5 p.m? Oh, sorry. On the 31st of January?
Okay.
To the Secretariat, and if there's issues with timelines, could you...
Matilda, if you can't find it, that's again another question I can ask DJAC.